Today I will be talking about reading Utopia, fiction, irony, and paradox. Thomas More's Utopia, which was written in 1516, contains the possibility of dynamic readings. It can be perceived as a straightforward political treatise or as a playful literary text that allows for multiple interpretations. I argue that the grounds on which Utopia invites profuse reading should be traced primarily to three features of the rhetoric: fiction, irony, and paradox. Understanding the fiction in Utopia not merely as a literary genre, but as a philosophical concept, grants a space for materializing the alternatives envisioned by its author. By identifying irony and paradox as parts of the whole rhetorical apparatus, readers are brought into More's own inner conflicts manifest in the grand dialogue of Utopia. An overlook of rhetorical sophistication results in a simpler utopia. Such a literal reading misses the pseudo-jocularity and ambivalence intended by Moore. This phenomenon of a simpler reading is especially pronounced in Mandarin editions, in which not only the wordplay, but also the rhetorical intricacies are also largely dismissed. A few case studies will be provided to demonstrate how the disengagement with More's rhetorical game has engendered very different Mandarin readings. In discussing the two sides of Utopia's dialogue, David Beventon points out that a critical reading of Utopia can be approached either as a socialist or an anti-communist way, thus making Thomas More revered in both Soviet Russia and the papacy. Karl Kautsky also held More as the prophet of modern communism. Today, Utopia has reached different nations and cultures to readers of different ages, age groups, interests, and agendas. What are certain readers reading Utopia for? Just like the news stories may be reported differently with different agendas, readers may also read, consciously or not, what fit their preconceived ideas depending on their religious, political beliefs, educational training and cultural background, so on and so forth. Tabula rasa, or a clean slate, is almost impossible. Readers always read with some preconceptions. In a word, it is never innocent. So with a text like Utopia that is so polysemic and open to versatile interpretations, Lemon Sargent asks, what does Utopia leave for those who do not know how to read the text before they read it? This is not just about those without a reading guide, but more subtly, I believe, to those who have no prior knowledge about Renaissance rhetoric that had an immense impact on the shaping of Utopia. I am analyzing not to reach a correct reading, but how understanding rhetoric of Utopia sheds light on the reading of it, especially to a target group whose prior knowledge about Renaissance rhetoric is usually limited. Why is the understanding of Renaissance rhetoric relevant to the reading of Utopia? Rhetoric was important in the early modern England, and it was part of the Renaissance curriculum. But why should such a remarkably distant readership, for example the Mandarin speakers, understand the rhetoric of Renaissance texts? What differences does it make to the reading experience with the rhetorical knowledge in mind? What kind of reading would it produce without knowing the basics of rhetoric, of the Renaissance rhetoric? Does it matter? That is the question. I began by looking to why Utopia was written in Latin as opposed to English. More's deliberate choice of composing Utopia in Latin lies in his fine grasp of the potential readership and rhetoric. It was intended for a learned readership who understood Latin. English at that time, like Italian and German, was the European vernaculars, less sophisticated than Latin. Rhetoric was a major component of the Renaissance curriculum. Renaissance itself represents a rebirth, and in humanist terms, it stands for the revival of classic rhetoric, among others. And rhetoric was part of the Studia Humanitatis, the study of the humanities. Hence, the learned readers will have relatively fewer difficulty discerning the subtleties in Utopia. The study of humanities was a school that covers the grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, aiming to testify how Renaissance humanism constitute much of Thomas More's life and earth, especially Utopia. Paul Oscar Chrysler defines what Renaissance humanists were, alerting to the fact that this term has been applied indiscriminately to scholars who preached vaguely defined human values. Chrysler specifies that Renaissance humanists were a group of highly trained scholars who either taught or learned studia humanitatis. In Thomas More's case, the 5 branches humanist studies have manifested themselves in different phases of his life and the work he engaged in. For instance, in the field of grammar and history, Moore composed commendatory verses for grammar books and gave lectures on Augustine's City of God, in which Roman history was among the major themes. In terms of rhetoric, Moore was a noted public orator, giving speeches in ceremonial occasions such as welcoming Charles V on his London visit. His abundant knowledge in history, especially humanist historiography, culminated in History of the Richard III, which Moore wrote in both Latin and English, but never managed to complete. As for poetry, Moore contributed both Latin and English poems, and moral philosophy, to which political philosophy belongs, exemplifies itself in Utopia. Author Kinley offers a brief account of the prominence attributed to rhetoric since the classical times, among which is one appraisal of the rhetoric. So rhetoric is necessary for all positions in life. The emotions of mind are inflamed by the sparks of speech. So too, the reason is impelled and moved by speeches. But Renaissance rhetoric shall not be confused with ancient rhetoric that was primarily about politics, nor with the modern notion of radical rhetoric that highlights the propagandist connotations of this phrase. It should also not be considered the equivalent of anti-rhetoric, whose access or nation only reflects pretenses. And yes, rhetoric is a powerful tool, but it could go both ways. It could be effective. It could also be misused or exploited to serve propaganda. So like what you have read in Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. That would be one great example. In addition to the set appraisal, the significance of the Renaissance rhetoric is also manifests itself in the most fundamental general presentation of Utopia. Utopia is divided into 2 books. Book 1, composed after Book 2, is of deliberative rhetoric or deliberative oratory. This type of oratory is usually a debate about policy or course of action, and is oftentimes presented in Platonic or Ciceronian dialogues. By expressing 2 or multiple opinions in a dialogic form, deliberative oratory is designed to persuade or dissuade without particularly favoring either side of the dialogue. Book 2, composed first and not in the dialogue, is of demonstrative oratory. It's usually a speech of praise or dispraise and can typically be seen in praising cities. And hence, the second book of Utopia exemplifies the demonstrative rhetoric in praise of the utopian commonwealth. In fact, demonstrative oratory is usually not about truth, but more allied to exaggeration and even fiction. Quintilian comments that poetry has been compared to the demonstrative oratory, and that it seeks to secure by inventing what is not merely untrue, but sometimes even incredible. John Tinkler therefore arrived at the fine line of reasoning that captures the rhetorical form of Utopia. When Moore switches from the deliberative mode of Book 1 to the demonstrative mode of Book 2, he switches from the realm of realistic deliberative advice to the realm of demonstrative hyperbole and fiction. The fictional quality of his Utopia, or No Place, is quite conventional for demonstrative oration. This analogy is important because it illustrates the compositional transition, and even more importantly, because it brings out the other crucial element in the whole rhetorical structure, that is, the fiction. So either as a political satire or as a playful text, Utopia in contemporary reading is considered a fiction because the utopian island and its people are fabricated. It's an invented narrative mixed with historical events. In fact, Walter Davis calls Utopia as Moore's developed work of fiction. It's important, however, to understand that the fiction in Utopia not just as literary genre, but as a philosophical concept. The Oxford English Dictionary offers multiple entries to define fiction, two of which are relevant to our interpretation. First of all, fiction is defined as feigning, counterfeiting, deceit, dissimulation, pretense. This dimension of fiction is pertinent in the discussion of utopian paradigms, the letters and the preface that's packaged in Utopia's main text, and especially in the first prefatory epistle from Moore to Giles. So in this letter, to emphasize his account is not fake. Moore writes, "I've taken particular pains to avoid having anything false in the book. So if anything is in doubt, I would rather say something untrue than tell a lie. In short, I would rather be honest than clever." And fiction is something untrue, but it is not a lie. There is always an element of reality in it. Nelson Goodman's definition of fiction explains it well that fiction cannot be about anything non-actual, since there is nothing non-actual, no merely possible or impossible worlds. Fiction, then, no matter how false or how far out, is about what is actual when about anything at all. As you're familiar with Animal Farm, there's another great example of an allegory having a profound element of reality in it. It's not impossible worlds because tyranny did happen in parts of that historical moment when Orwell wrote it. And secondly, fiction is the species of literature which connect concerns with the narration of imagined events and the characters, and which reflects the generic quality of utopia. And another OD entry goes, invention as opposed to fact. And this is where the interesting intersection between fiction and fact begins. When distinguishing fiction and poetry, Harry Berger indicates that fiction is, and I quote, etymologically and semantically related to terms meaning invention, creation, construction, and to terms meaning illusion. It suggests both something made and something made of, end quote. However, in explaining the Latin roots of fiction and fact, Martin Prohaska suggests that these two terms are in fact not so much disconnected, and that fiction shall not be confused with illusion or fallacy. In fact, during the Renaissance, fiction was already connected with the notion of a second world or heterocosm, meaning the other world. Heterocosm is a concept that considers the second world as, and I quote, created by poets in an act analogous to God's creation of the world. And poetry and fiction were interchangeable concepts in the Renaissance. God's creation is the first world, and the fiction, or the world created by writers, is the second world. In a similar vein, Hayden White writes, what Aristotle held in mind when, instead of opposing history to poetry, he suggested their complementarity, joining both of them to philosophy in the human effort to represent, imagine, and think the world in its totality, both actual and possible, both real and imagined, both known and only experienced. And indeed, Moore creates a different world in and with Utopia, a fabricated realm embodying the author's aspiration as presented in the textual narrative. Indeed, this second world finds resonance not only in fiction as a means of creating the other world, but which also understands Utopia as a heterocosm presenting the alternatives. This actually brings us back to the definition of utopia and dystopia. So as you can see here, I'll just go straight to the dystopia, the negative utopia. A non-existent society described in considerable detail and normally located in time and space, and the author intended a contemporaneous readers to view as considerably worse than the society in which the reader lived. And pay attention to this, to view as considerably worse than the society in which the reader lived. Moore created in Utopia a considerably better society than the Tudor England. In Animal Farm or 1984, in which you would call dystopia, what you see is a considerably worse society, warning people off. So So fiction is to provide a thinking space to create an alternatively better or worse than the society you live in. So in fundamental sense, more creates or remains a world in utopia. So seeing fiction as such, an exploratory medium is to treat fiction in utopia as a second world in which potentialities find a place for materialization. And following that, I would like to consider irony and paradox together as many of the coin names or certain passages and events in utopia as a dialogue are manifestation of both ironic reversals and paradox. Utopia as a book is a great scheme of paradox aiming to uncover the truth. And author Mellock argues that book 2 alone is a classical paradox, a praise of nowhere. What Moore did in writing book 1 was to complete the dialogue by supplying the other speakers and define the occasional title days declamation. So what is paradox? So paradox, the etymology of paradox comes from para, distinct from, and doxa, opinion. We have commonly used paradox to refer to a situation, an occurrence, or statement that is itself contradictory or absurd. It's not far from how paradox was understood during the early modern period. Specifically, Sister Mariam Joseph indicates that paradox in the 16th century had a twofold meaning. The first one is a statement contrary to received opinion, evoking wonder because it's marvelous, strange, and incredible. And the second one would be the statement apparently self-contradictory, as you can see in Utopia, the term itself. And the simplest example is how gold and jewelry are frowned upon by the utopians. They are made into chamber pots or to cuff prisoners. Urinating in a chamber pot made of gold is a direct challenge and contrary to the generally received ideas. Other examples of the paradoxes can be seen in utopians' attitudes toward death penalty and the warfare. They are against capital punishment. Thieves are not to be hanged, like what Moore criticized of the Tudor England. But for people who committed adultery the second time, they could be sentenced to death. And for warfare, utopians are against it, but their men and women grew up with a military training. And they avoid sending their, with the quality is part of their feature, but they avoid sending their own people to battlefield, but hire the Swiss missionary because they consider those who are willing to die for money not as worthy as themselves. And the example goes on and on. And paradoxicality in names, on the other hand, requires a profound effort to decipher, especially in translations. It appears that most names related to Utopia are paradoxical, as Utopia itself. We're already familiar that the names of the island Utopia is contradictory, a happy place that is no place. Some basic knowledge of Greek and Latin is required to decipher the message, however disguised or otherwise. In fact, when commenting on Moore's inquisitiveness, James Rome argues that the Greek and Latin serve for Moore as a kind of code, the meaning of which could be extracted only imperfectly or not at all. The names of the narrator, Raphael Hypode, is the prime example. So the first name, Raphael, it could mean messenger from God in Greek, or God has healed in Hebrew. The surname, from a combination of the Greek hyphals and dials, is most commonly translated as expert in trifles or well-learned in nonsense. The name Hypode, like many other names in Utopia, is double encoded. Although the linguistic group can be traced, the result often frustrates the readers, who are often left incredibly confused about what Moore intends to convey. Elizabeth McCartan postulates that then there's the name of the narrator. Is this world traveler of the healer of God, the opener of eyes, as his first name suggests, or the peddler of nonsense his family name speaks of, or both, so that we must both believe and disbelieve him and his narration. The utopian society depicted in the second book is Hyphode's eyewitness account. If the person who recounts his utopian experience has a name insinuating that the narrator himself is an expert in nonsense, how much can readers take his words for real? Such ambivalence unfortunately has been lost in most of the Mandarin translations. The most common translational practice of the foreign name into Mandarin is to use transliterations, and which is not always accompanied by a footnote or endnotes explaining its original meaning. And in this particular case, the rule of transliteration applies almost consistently among all the Mandarin translations. And we have 14 Mandarin the standalone translations. And as you can see, Raphael is the common Christian name, just like Thomas or Peter, and which already has a prevalent rendering that is Raphael. There's very minor nuance in the second character with differences in intonation and radical, but this is of very little research value. And a few points are worth mentioning here. Liu Chenshao, 1935, and Liu Lingsheng, 1935, Liu Chenshao, 1957, and Guo Xiangzhang's 1966 only translate the given name, Raphael, without offering his surname. And to be specific, the parenthetical notes in both Liu Lingsheng and Liu Chenshao's edition misspells Raphael Hyphaday as Hyphaday and defines Raphael to be the ideal person. An ideal person comes nowhere close to expert in nonsense. Presumably, Liu Lingsheng generalizes the narrator who talks about the ideal world to be an ideal person himself. And as you can see, the 2013 Penguin edition uses transliteration as well. However, instead of transliterating Hyphaday, its copy text is Paul Turner's rendition, Raphael Nonsenso. Turner had in mind when translating Morse coin names that the names will strike modern Anglophone readers as the name in Latin to the Latin readers. The Yale Utopia or the Cambridge bilingual edition are the cardinal reference editions, but in my view, no other translation has surpassed Paul Turner's success in rendering the same effect as the Latin did. However, this 2013 edition has spoiled the fun by failing to provide any notes to the transliterated names. So nonsenso becomes nosenso. This omission makes the rendered surname not just less acute, but pointless, because nonsenso is rendered with proximity to its English pronunciation. It can also be printed as 诺所生, 我所生诺. The order of these three characters can be reversed, switched, or even replaced with other characters. It would not have mattered much because readers would not have understood that this foreign surname had a profound implication embedded in its naming construction. What is the point of satirizing the nonsense of this narrator's credibility when the brilliant anglicized name nonsenso is reproduced in a set of characters that sacrifice its referential meanings? Let alone mosenso is not a literal translation, whose characters do not reveal anything slightly resembling nonsense. And the Penguin edition was published in 2013. The other translation modeling on Paul Turner's was published 35 years earlier, and in the case of Raphael Hyphaday, it reproduced a name closest to what Moore would have intended, Raphael Wuji, literally Raphael nonsense. The translated surname Wuji stems from the Indian Wuji Zhitan, the talk of nonsense or a groundless statement. Its translator Liu Lihua specifies in the endnote that the original name is Raphael Nonsenso, whose original meaning is Wuji Zhitan, and that she adopts the sense-for-sense translation to be Wuji. This would serve as an inquiry into the double identity of this narrator. How much are we to trust him, given his name of God, healer, and a surname of nonsense peddler? If translators understood what roles paradox plays in Moore's Utopia, they would have found it necessary to render the Mandarin equivalents, or at least provide explanatory notes. But even then, it wouldn't have been the same reading experience because the reading flow would have been interrupted. In this case, Liu Lihua's version is unparalleled. It is unfortunate that her edition has not managed to survive. So here we have this narrator whose name is a paradox, recounting his travel in an island whose name is also a paradox. And the biggest paradox culminates in the ending scene when Moore concludes that, and I quote, "Meantime, while I can hardly agree with everything he said, Raphael, though he is a man of unquestionable learning and enormous experience of human affairs, yet I freely confess that in the utopian commonwealth, there are very many features in our own societies I would wish rather than expect to see." And does Moore believe in it? It seems like a no. The last sentence could be a tell. He knows it's impractical, but he could also at the same time aspire to it. It leaves an open-ended inquiry for all readers to decipher and to decide. For this, I'll briefly go over a few Mandarin translations to see how the ambiguity is rendered. And I choose the most recent 3 editions and the one from 2007. So as you can see here, most Mandarin translations do translate this rather wish than hope, expect to see. And yet we also have this 2011 bilingual edition that mistranslates and totally reverses the meaning as 我不只希望而且愿意看到. That was totally opposite the authorial meaning. We also have Hu Fengfei's translation, which here, that expands the passage into a much lengthier version. It does also render this rather wish than expect to see. But the last sentence, 我宁愿相信这份宁静和陶然的生活就存在于这个世界的某个角落. I have to be honest, I didn't translate this. I hired someone, but I wasn't very satisfied with her translation. I'll do it much later. And this last sentence about the tranquility, it shows that his understanding of utopia is not precisely the political allegory that Moore had intended. It has become a pastoral version of utopia like Peach Blossom Spring, like 桃花源. So today my talk is about the reading of Utopia. I discuss how fiction in Utopia provides a space for materializing alternatives, even just on paper. I also use the name of the narrator and the concluding passage to show how the ironic reversal and paradox in Utopias are. But understanding the paradoxical meanings in the name will not point us to a certain way of reading. It will not tell us if Utopia should be read as a political satire, a communist treatise, or a playful literary text. But being aware of the frequency of paradox that we experience in reading Utopia should draw our attention to question what exactly we are reading. This is the one important lesson that I take from Utopia. The rhetorical devices that Moore adopts all point to one direction, to revitalize the thought process and to develop one's own critical approach towards the text. It's a creative process. There could be different readings, no right or wrong. Important thing is not to take things or the text as it is, but to question, to challenge, and to reflect. Thank you.